Employee retention tax credit audits are probably going to be the biggest compliance initiative within the IRS over the next several years. Employee retention tax credit fraud made the IRS's Dirty Dozen list. Not only did it make the Dirty Dozen list, but it made the very top spot on the Dirty Dozen list for 2023. By all measures, the IRS sort of got caught flat-footed by what has happened with employee retention tax credits. You had a pandemic-related program that didn't have a cap on the amount of funds that were dispersed, and where a lot of bad actors got into the space and very quickly started filing erroneous employee retention tax credits and committing all sorts of other bad acts. This has been a huge problem for the IRS and has left the IRS scrambling to try and deal with it. What seems to be the IRS's response is let's audit as many taxpayers as we can and try and undo some of the damage that employee retention tax credits has caused the government. So today we're going to walk through why audits are a big deal, what you can do to protect yourself, and how to move forward in the audit process. So let's start by understanding the framework of what we're dealing with. So the IRS has divided their audit division into three basic sets of audits. You have correspondence audits, which are audits that are conducted by mail. You have an office audit, where you have somebody physically sitting at a desk at the IRS and conducting an audit there and asking the taxpayer to bring in information or mail information to them. And then you've got what we call a field audit, which is where the auditor will go out into the field and do an investigation on the taxpayer. So what we're seeing with employee retention tax credit audits is less so from correspondence and more so from office audits or field audits. Now, based on our experience as a firm, what we are learning is the IRS is building large compliance groups made of tens or dozens of auditors that are designed to audit taxpayers for the employee retention tax credit. What happens if you get audited for the employee retention tax credit? Well, when you get an audit notice in the mail, it basically informs you that you're going to be audited, and then it describes what you need to do by what dates. Usually there's a request to provide documents and or contact the auditor by a certain date to set up an appointment with the auditor. It may not be immediately apparent whether your auditor is a desk auditor or an office auditor or a field auditor. Chances are, if the auditor is not in the city that you're in, it is a desk audit versus a field audit. Usually when field auditors are assigned to cases, they are assigned locally. So if you don't see an auditor in your local jurisdiction, you can assume it's a desk audit. So what are the characteristics of a desk audit? A desk auditor is someone who has been trained in doing payroll tax audits, specifically those surrounding the employee retention tax credit and other pandemic-related credits. It's a very high volume job. It's a very repetitive job. And so this person, as anyone naturally would when you hand them a big pile of work, just wants to get through it as quickly as possible. And so what you're gonna see from the auditor is a push to get the process completed as quickly as they can and just to check the box. Now, when the auditor has 50 to 70 files at one time, they don't have the courtesy of getting to know the nuances of each case. And so what they're trying to do is come in, make sure that things are correct according to their audit checklist, and go through that process as fast as they can. So what are they looking for? Well, number one, they're looking for math and to make sure that the credit was calculated correctly, so that they know mathematically any adjustments that need to be made. And number two, they're looking for substantiation and support around the credit. Now, the IRS is not dumb. So what the IRS has historically done, and what we expect them to do with employee retention tax credit audit cases, is to go through and identify taxpayers based on location and based on industry, which are more likely than not going to produce some sort of error in their filings or result in money being sent back to the government. So, unsurprisingly, we can expect the IRS to audit people in states that have lesser restrictions, fewer government orders, and where the regulatory framework may not necessarily support claiming the employee retention tax credit. How does the IRS know what industry you're in? Well, your tax returns contain something that's called an NAICS code. It's a classification code that most people kind of gloss over, but that every accountant has to go through and check the box of what category you fall into. So you can expect to see a lot of employee retention tax credit audits around construction, around manufacturing, around professional services, and lots of other types of business based on that classification code. And so what is the auditor looking for? The auditor is looking for evidence of impact, and the taxpayer needs to show that the business was more than nominally impacted, and that more than nominal impact was caused by a government order. Now, it's important to note at this point, particularly on the desk side, you are not dealing with an attorney. This is not a court of law. So equally as the auditor is going through a check the box kind of process, if you respond by helping them check the boxes, you can move through the audit quickly, cleanly, and easily. In every audit situation, you're going to have good facts and you're going to have some bad facts. And so you can't necessarily hide the bad facts, but you want to change the order in which you play them in. So the first thing that you're going to do in developing a strategy is you're going to look at the document request. The document request is generally a roadmap for understanding what the auditor is targeting and what they're interested in. By dealing with the major issues, assuming that you can deal with them successfully, you're going to take that off the auditor's plate, and the rest of the audit should hopefully go much more smoothly. If you can't deal with the major issues to your satisfaction or in a way that you think is going to get past the auditor, then you want to try and work on damage control. The auditors for employee retention tax credit audits are insisting on speaking with taxpayers. Now, normally a representative is able to handle these conversations and get in the way. But because of the fraud around the employee retention tax credit, because of the bad behaviors of promoters, the IRS is very interested in using audits and using taxpayer interviews as a means to go after the really bad guys. And so there's a section of questions which differentiates from a normal payroll tax audit all about the preparers and what the preparation process was like and what level of diligence you had to go through and this, that, or the other. Even though the questions are dictated towards the conduct of the preparer, you still need to be careful in any sort of employee retention tax credit audit situation, because what you're dealing with is you're dealing with questions that can relate to how much are you going to be penalized in the audit. If it's very clear at the beginning of the audit there was a lack of diligence on your part, you're basically building a case for the auditor to hit you with a more serious penalty than they otherwise would. The advantage of having a representative defend your audit versus having you handle it yourself is that the representative or the attorney in question has the ability to deflect questions, whereas the taxpayer can't necessarily deflect questions because most of the questions pertain to the taxpayer's business. So usually what we'd want to do in an audit situation is make the taxpayer available for the interview, prep the taxpayer ahead of time so we know what the taxpayer is going to say, because again, the questions are fairly routine, they're fairly standard, they're fairly formulaic. Have the taxpayer go through the interview process, the taxpayer will give the answers that we want the taxpayer to give, and then we will excuse the taxpayer from the rest of the process and have the representative handle it. This is true even if we don't have anything to hide. A lot of people get an audit notice and say, I didn't do anything wrong. And so let me just go in and present and everything should be okay. You would think that this is true. But again, the auditor is not overly concerned with facts. Their goal is to get through the process. And so even in a situation where the taxpayer didn't do anything wrong, because the IRS operates on a system of highly mechanical processes, sometimes taxpayers with good facts get caught up in the system. So that's the way that audits generally work at the desk level. And now let's talk about how they work at the field level. So when you're dealing with a field auditor is generally more trained, they're generally more senior, and they're generally more sophisticated than your standard desk auditor. Dealing with a field auditor is a signal that your case has risen up a level of seniority, or that the IRS has taken a particular interest in your case over and above this routine mechanized desk audit process. You're dealing with somebody who is generally very sharp, or they've at least been in their job for a long time, or they've at least been very well trained. And so you have to be very, very careful in walking into this situation. I will point out, although it's probably not a concern in most cases, that it's the field auditors that get called into cases that involve fraud or where the IRS suspects malfeasance. Not every field audit has fraud associated with it, but you should be careful because there are certain field auditors that will tend to the presumption that something fraudulent has happened or that the taxpayer willingly participated in something that they knew was too good to be true, and you get people who are used to jumping to those different types of conclusions. The auditor is going to go in there with an objective. If you're hitting a field auditor, there's a reason. It's either the size of the credit or they found something. And so you got to figure out what that is ahead of time, and you have to really plan for that. As you're going through the audit process, the best piece of advice I can give you is to be as prepared as possible for what you're about to go through. Being prepared for an audit is just the best insurance policy. Even if nothing ultimately comes out of it, even if it's smooth sailing, the prep work and the foresight and the preparation going in is really going to make the difference in the context of an employee retention tax credit audit. If you need assistance, please contact your friendly neighborhood tax attorney at Brotman Law, who will be happy to help you with all aspects of employee retention tax credit compliance, and will be happy to defend you in an employee retention tax credit audit if circumstances do arise. Our team of experienced tax attorneys not only understands the framework of the employee retention tax credit inside and out, but we've handled hundreds and hundreds of audits over the years and have a very good framework in how the IRS operates, how the judicial system operates above the IRS, and how to move you through the system, incurring as little damage as possible. Thank you for listening, and look forward to working with you in the future.